Bruce Dinges is retired Director of Publications of the Arizona Historical Society and editor of the Journal of Arizona History, as well as a longtime panelist for the Pima County Library's Southwest Books of the Year. Bill Broyles is a research associate at the University of Arizona's Southwest Center and writes about our great Southwest borderlands and its people. His collaborative bookwork includes Blast Water on the Devil's Highway, Field Man, Sunshot, Desert Duty, and Dry Borders. He and Bruce have teamed up on this book about Charles Budden, America's most alarming writer, and on a special issue of Journal of the Southwest about Bowden.
Welcome to the Charles Budden, America's Most Alarming Writer program, presented by the Apache Junction Public Library in September of 2020. And thank you for joining us this morning. And a tip of the hat, I've been saving this new Stetson for a special occasion, and today is it because I can't find any other place to wear it. But thanks to you for supporting your local library, and thanks to Vicki DeRain for inviting us, and Megan Sparks for her tech help. We're darned lucky to have the Apache Junction Library. And thanks to the Writer in Residence program sponsored by the Arizona State Library that made this program possible. And whether you've never read or heard of Charles Budden, or you've read his every book, we're delighted that you're here. Some of you may have known him better than we did, but we count him among our special friends. And I'm Bill Broyles. This is Bruce Dinges. We love books, and even more, we love readers and writers. By the end of our little talk this morning, we hope you understand better of who was Charles Budden and why his words matter. You may know Chuck, as we'll call him in this talk, from his featured articles in Arizona Highways, even in the past couple of years. And you may have seen a story about him in the August Harper's magazine, and his next book, Sonata, will be out in November. Not bad for a writer who died back in 2014. Bruce, what was the first Bowden book you read, and when did you first meet him?
I had a pretty inauspicious first meeting. I had met Chuck probably before I read his first book. My first one was Blue Desert, and that's about the time I met Chuck, the early 1980s. He was still working for the Citizen, and I was part of a little group of people at the Arizona Historical Society, the U of A, who met for lunch on Wednesdays in a little Mexican restaurant on Grant Road, and Chuck showed up. I don't recall if he was invited by my predecessor at the Historical Society, Tracy Rowe, or if he showed up because Julian Hayden was a regular attendee at that gathering and somebody Chuck much admired. And what I remember from that conversation basically is we talked a lot about the new K-Pro word processor, which the Historical Society had just obtained, and which Chuck was fooling around with himself. So from that point, Chuck was kind of a fixture off and on in my life for the remainder of his and during my career in Tucson. He was somebody that I could call on anytime. I don't think Chuck ever said no to me, no matter what I was asking for. I often asked him if he would speak at a program. He'd say, sure. I remember once he, in his then significant other, Sandy Lanham, actually flew to Yuma in her plane to deliver a talk. You know, something that would show up at our book fair every year at the Historical Society. One of the easiest people to get along with professionally that I'd ever encountered, and Chuck was somebody. I just remember one instance. Certainly, I called him up before I knew him very often one morning about 10:30, and to ask him something on the phone. I don't remember exactly what it was, and I was on the phone for about 45 minutes. Chuck had been reading Kierkegaard and working on his book on Charles Keating, and was fascinated with the concept of man and Superman. And I didn't have to say anything. I got a lecture for about 45 minutes. Felt like I ought to be taking notes, but I learned a lot after we hung up. And so that was my entree to Chuck.
My first entree to Chuck was Blue Desert also, but kind of more indirectly, because a mutual friend called me up and said, there's this crazy reporter that wants to walk across the desert. Not just any desert, but the low Sonoran Desert in June, and do a night hike from the Mexican border to a small farm town called Tacna over by Yuma. And I went over to talk this guy out of doing that trip, and by the end of it, he convinced me that not only we could do it, but we should do it. And that was kind of why he picked the story down at the Tucson Citizen, because people told him, Chuck, you will die and you cannot write the story. Of course, he decided, I will do the story. And it became part of a larger spread and a bigger story about migrants crossing the border, dying in the desert, et cetera, which is a continuing story. But that was featured in Blue Desert. And so Blue Desert I was in it. I was surprised to pick it up, and here's my name in a chapter. He didn't run it by me or ask me about any of the quotes, but like every experience I ever had with Chuck when he wrote about people, it was accurate. It may not be exactly what you wanted to say or perfectly flattering, but it was what happened. He didn't invent, he didn't embellish, he told the story. And that story of the migrants, paired with some of his work in Tucson on child sex crimes, became part of a Pulitzer Prize nomination for Chuck. And he won the first round of the prize in his category by the committee. But then the Pulitzer family overruled, and somebody else was actually given the award. But in Chuck's very short newspaper career, about 3 years at the Tucson Citizen, he rose from nobody to a prize winner and a Pulitzer finalist. So that was my first experience with Chuck. He was the real deal. He could hike all night long, and we did about 40 miles across the desert. Had a wonderful story, and it's still heartrending to read it. But Chuck was the real deal, and we had some other big hikes too that I really enjoyed. But you know, Chuck Bruce billed himself as a historian of the future. And why did he think of himself as a historian, and where did he come from intellectually? What's his bio?
Yeah, I don't think I've got several books. Chuck was common because I came here with a PhD in history, and Chuck used to inscribe my books. There aren't any footnotes, but Chuck, for somebody who was just recently out of graduate school myself, Chuck was always an intellectual. He may not have had the persona, he may not have cultivated it, but he was a historian and a researcher at heart. And just as far as bio goes, actually, just coincidentally, Chuck and I were born about 60 miles apart from each other. He was a little older than I was, but he was born on July 20th, 1945, and spent his earliest days on a small farm outside of Joliet, northern Illinois. At about the age of 4, his dad, Jude, who was sort of an autodidact and an attorney for the IRS, moved the family, which at that time consisted of Chuck and his mother, Bo, his older brother, George, and his sister, Peg, to the south side of Chicago. And just coincidentally, Phil Caputo in our book did an essay on this. He also grew up on the south side of Chicago, which is near the stockyards where my dad used to take me when I was a little kid. It was a big trip, and we took cattle up there. And Phil said, you know, he and Chuck knew bullshit when they smelled it, and that kind of is the core of a lot of what Chuck wrote. When in 1957, Jude also had, in addition to an attachment to Shakespeare, he also had a fascination with the American West, and he decided to pack the family up and move first to Tombstone, was his destination. But Chuck's mother managed to talk him out of that, and they ended up fortunately moving to Tucson. Chuck attended Tucson High, graduated from the University of Arizona, and then he received a master's in intellectual history at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, wrote his doctoral dissertation, but then walked away from his PhD without ever, well, he completed the dissertation, but it was never accepted for the doctorate for reasons we can discuss later. After a year teaching at the University of Illinois Chicago Circle, he was convinced that he wasn't cut out for going into a classroom every day and delivering lectures. So academia wasn't his thing. At that point, he returned to Tucson, worked for various odd jobs, including a stint at the U of A Office of Land Studies, where he completed a study of desert water usage that the department actually turned down. It eventually became his first book, Killing the Hidden Waters, which is still in print today, University of Texas Press. A second book, Street Signs Chicago, with his friend activist Lou Kreinberg, followed. Chuck later recalled that he had $7 in his bank account when he walked into the Tucson Citizen office and asked for a job. Although he had no journalism experience, he was hired, and he quickly became a legend at the Citizen, winning a bushel of regional and local awards. As Bill said, a series of articles he wrote on immigration, desert crossings, and on Tucson sex crimes were finalists for the Pulitzer, which he won but didn't, and then unwon. From 1986 to 89, he and his friend Dick Bonnier, who was a legendary editor at the Citizen, edited the short-lived and much lamented City magazine, which featured literate and often hard-hitting stories by some of Tucson's finest writers. When the magazine folded, Chuck cashed his last paycheck and turned full-time to his real passion, writing books that explored the world around him in riveting prose and with uncompromising and often very uncomfortable honesty. The 26 titles he cranked out over the next 2 decades earned him, if not necessarily a national audience, at least a dedicated following. Unfortunately, book royalties don't put food on the table, so to earn a living, he accepted well-paying magazine assignments for the likes of Harper's, Mother Jones, GQ, Esquire, National Geographic, and Arizona Highways. Chuck once complained that bookstores never know where to put my stuff. His topics range broadly from nature and environment to drug cartels, climate change, globalization, human greed, and his personal demons. In a talk he delivered to the Tucson-Pima County Public Library, Chuck explained that he had reached certain conclusions that he felt defined the course of his life and career. Just to quote Chuck, he said, "I decided that the best way to understand something was to go to the edge. This desert was the edge of natural resources as Americans understand the term. And here in its heat and persistent droughts, I could make sense out of all those dull terms like the environment or ecology. I believe and still believe with every bit of my being that the future is going to be a collision between limited resources and unlimited human appetites. And finally, I came back to the border for the sheer energy of the only place on earth where a first world industrial economy rubs up against a dirt world of poverty." His obsession, as Bill said, was to write a history of my times based on these beliefs and notions. And one of our goals in compiling America's Most Alarming Writer was to call on Chuck's friends and colleagues to bear witness to how he lived and worked and to explain why that matters.
Yeah, literally, Chuck was an edgy writer, and he sought the edge. He talked about the edge. And when we talk about writing the history of the future, we have to remember that his book, What Is, about the town, was subtitled The Laboratory of Our Future. And Chuck, for those of you who haven't read Chuck, you need to realize that Chuck lived to write, literally. That was his purpose in life and his default setting. It was to hunt the story down and pound it into submission. And he had 2 questions when people asked him if he would write something for them, whether it was for pay or just for free. He'd say, how soon, how long, because he could automatically kick into his newspaper mode of how long the story could be, how many words he had, how he had to focus the story and make the story. He would often write the story in his head, driving back from the interview to the newspaper office, so he could simply pound it out. But you have to remember, he was a newsman and a reporter. He's not a glitzy writer. He's not for the celebrityism. He was in it for the story, and it was that adrenaline of the deadlines. And he didn't call himself a writer ever, and certainly not an author, because author sounds like a dilettante of some kind. And he wasn't a wannabe. He was the real deal. I remember one time, Bruce, that I was working on a small book about ornithologist Gail Monson. And I emailed Chuck and I said, Chuck, you knew Gale. Could you write something brief about him? And instead of spending 15 minutes to write a note about how I don't have time for this silly project, I'm not busy making money, he wrote it. And within 15 minutes came back the same thing that I published in the book about Gale Monson. A beautiful, short, concise, to the point piece about Gale. I think David Allmendinger, among the people, Bruce, that we looked up and got information from, said something that was very penetrating even for us who knew Chuck. He said, and David Allmendinger is a historian who's written books and a professor of history. He said, I sensed that he wanted nothing more than to write in some new way about subjects that no one had addressed. And I think if you look at the summation of Chuck's career, he met that goal. And I don't know, I didn't ever heard Chuck express it that way, but David did. And I think David was right on the money on that. And Chuck's writing was an end to itself. He wasn't interested in a fancy house or a new car. He lived to write. When he went to bed, he was thinking about a story. When he got up in the morning, he was writing a story, even if it didn't pay or was for publication. And part of it goes back to something he said about the newsroom, where he found, in essence, life. It gave him meaning much more so than the college classrooms or faculty meetings or prepping something for publication in an academic journal with lots of footnotes. He said, I got hooked on the newsroom and never recovered, nor wanted to. And in my mind, at least, if Chuck had heroes, it'd be people like John Reed, who covered the Mexican Revolution, or big city newspaper reporters like Mike Royko, Pete Dexter, Jimmy Breslin. But Bruce, which writers would you compare Chuck to? And can you separate Chuck the writer from Chuck the person?
No, it's a whole package. But it's kind of interesting, that list you said. I had not, when you mentioned John Reed, most people think 10 Days That Shook the World, with the book that Reed was on as a correspondent, was on the scene with during the Russian Revolution. But the book Chuck admired was Insurgent Mexico, the book that Reed wrote based on his correspondence during the Mexican Revolution. And I just out of curiosity, I always wanted to read it, and I finally did. And you can see why Chuck admired it, because Reed was there on the action. He had a feel for the country, for the people. You can feel the desert heat. It's the sort of stuff that would have attracted Chuck, plus the novelty and the danger of it all. And it's in just sort of a peculiar aside. This was a couple of years before Chuck passed away, but he had already moved to Las Cruces, and none of us had seen him for a while. And his sister Peg called me and invited me to just to have dinner with her and her husband and the next door neighbors across the canyon down at Rio Rico, who was Pete Dexter and his wife Diane. And so, I don't know what, and she made sure to tell Chuck that we were having dinner with the Dexters. And I since devoured just about everything Pete Dexter wrote as well. And again, you can see this kind of raw talent that Dexter had. It's a very masculine, sort of in your face kind of journalism, the kind that got Pete Dexter beat up within an inch of his life at one point. And so it's easy to see from his idols the kind of style he had. Chuck himself, he may never call himself a writer, but a Chuck Bowden piece when you pick it up. There's nothing quite like it. And I think when Bill talks about to David Allmendinger, we saw some of the correspondence that Chuck had with David when they were both in graduate school, and it was there already. When he was in his early 20s. Where it came from, we never quite figured out. He always told me, I don't have time to read fiction, but I know he did, because he wrote the foreword to a reprint edition of Jack Kerouac's Sometimes a Great Notion, which may be the great American novel. But I think probably the person who came, and this kind of hit both certainly me and I think Bill too, was one of those face slappers when we read the Bill Du Bois wrote the introduction to Desierto, I think. Maybe I'd be wrong about that. And Du Bois put his finger on it, I think. He said the person that Chuck reminded him of more than anybody else was James Agee. That the reviewers really didn't know what to do with Agee because his prose was so different from anything they had read before, and it was the same kind of, they didn't resemble each other necessarily, but it was the same impulse to make you, draw you into the story, make you see these people, make you feel what they were feeling, and put you into the scene. And so I think that's the person I would compare him to as well.
What was that story that Chuck told about his father and honesty?
Yeah, toward the close of his life, although he didn't know it, he was interviewed by Angus Anderson about 2 years before he passed away, which is a really interesting interview. And it's in an issue of the Journal of the Southwest that we did. Bill, you probably have a copy there that's devoted to Chuck as well. And Chuck remembered his dad asking him something about honesty, and Chuck just sort of gave a flippant answer. And he said, honesty is the best policy. And his dad exploded. And he said, it's not just, you don't say, you're not honest because it's going to get you something. You're either honest or you're a goddamn liar. And I think that stuck with Chuck. It obviously stuck with Chuck. And I think if you keep that in mind, when you look at Chuck's work, particularly for me, an article he did in Harper's called Torch Song, which is honest to the point of being painful, both about the sex trafficking years that he spent with the Citizen, but his own personal nightmare sort of that he had with that kind of a job. And like I say, it's beautifully written. It's incredibly compelling, but he doesn't cut himself any slack. If he's done something bad, if he thinks he's down the wrong track, he'll tell you about it. And so I think if you keep that kind of thing that his dad told him in mind, it kind of clears up a lot of the meaning behind what Chuck did.
Bruce, you were talking about the book, our book. This is a copy of its cover with Chuck and his Rednecks for Social Responsibility hat that he wore on a hike from Yuma to Palm Springs one summer with Jack Dykinga. And also here is the spring issue of the Journal of the Southwest with Chuck on the cover, spring issue 2019. And we have essays in both of those by a wonderful cadre of Chuck's friends. And just very, very enlightening about who he was. But, what amazes me about Chuck, Bruce, is that he had such a zigzag career. When he came out of the box at the Tucson Citizen and started being known and publishing with the U of A Press books like Blue Desert, about the desert of Southwest Arizona, and Frog Mountain Blues, about the wonderful, beautiful Catalina Mountains just north of Tucson. He was kind of projected to be the next Ed Abbey or David Thoreau or John Muir, a nature writer. But then Chuck confused a few people with books like Mescal and Redline. And then he went over with Jack Dykinga and did what they called eco-porn or eye candy, of beautiful books about nature, Sonoran Desert, Stone Canyons about the Escalante Grand Staircase area, and Secret Forest, and even essays in Jack's Arizona Highways books, beautiful books. And Chuck, part of that was that connection going back to his time at the Arid Lands Department at the University of Arizona. And he had a number of researchers, people like Ray Turner, Rod Hastings, Paul Martin, Julian Hayden, Gary Knappman, had him on speed dial. And he could call them up and talk to them anytime and go out and do the research. But he also had some other things going. And one of them was that he loved Walker Evans and Dorothea Lange and some other photographers. And he worked with people like Jack Dykinga and Eugene Richards, which Eugene did some serious social documentary work with very disturbing images, very raw. And then Chuck, as Jack said, Chuck had kind of an eye for photography and detail. And so he could organize a story kind of like you would organize a photograph. And in the Journal of the Southwest, we have, and also I think a piece in the book, about Chuck interviewing a tire out there in the desert. He actually got down on his hands and knees and looked at this tire and described it and talked to it and tried to get answers out of it, so to speak. But he went on then to do some of his border books, like What Is, Laboratory of Our Future with Julian Cardona, and with Michael Berman he did Exodus and other books like that. But part of it at the same time was that newspaper gig that he had. And for him it was addictive, because you got to go out and you talk to the victims, you talk to the police, you talk to everybody, talk to the criminals in many cases. And about murder, rape, child molestation, greed, and so on. So his own ramblings at that time became a series of books called Desierto, Blood Orchid, Blues for Cannibals, Some of the Dead Are Still Breathing. You can tell from the titles and the words that these are kind of raw stories. And some of us were kind of thrown off by that, because he himself took this detour over to What Is, and he was captivated by the murder of the women in What Is, and did a series of books about drugs and cartel, things like Down by the River, Shadow in the City, Dreamland with Alice Briggs drawings. And if you don't have a nightmare after reading that book, I don't think you turn the page. And Murder City. And his next book, his last book, the one coming out in November, called Sonata. But Sonata is really part of the unnatural history of America. And Sonata is about all the bloodlust of mankind, and Chuck tries to balance it with the beauty of nature and see if we can come to some kind of peace and restoration of the human soul. But I mean, Chuck went all over the map as far as what he wrote about, everything from hummingbirds to El Sicario, the man who killed who knows how many hundreds of people. So, but Bruce, I think viewers may want to know, with that background of the zigzag of the books, where did our title for America's most alarming writer come from?
We owe a lot to Jim Harrison in this book, and it starts with the title. It comes from the Charles Budden reader that Jim Harrison wrote the introduction to. Harrison lived down in Patagonia in the winter time, and Chuck often hid out down there, house set for Jim when he was up in Montana in the summers, or Michigan fishing and whatever. And I just remember Chuck always had bird feeders out there, and Jim said one time he came back and Chuck had all these hummingbird feeders, and he said it was like a blizzard of hummingbirds. I've never got quite that image out of my mind, but Harrison said in that introduction that reading Chuck was like riding in a Ferrari at 100 miles an hour with no brakes. And he gives the example. He said too that he had loaned one of Chuck's books to a friend of his, and the friend called him back a couple of days later and just chewed him out. He said, what are you giving me this stuff for? He said, I haven't slept in 3 nights. And Harrison, he just said, he just responded, well, that's the point. You don't deserve to. And it's again gets back to the core of what Chuck was doing, and that is to hold people's face to some uncomfortable truths that they'd maybe rather not read about, that he felt though that was crucial that we understand if we were to solve any of the problems that were pressing the world then and now and into the foreseeable future. Chuck, funnily enough, he's got kind of a dour reputation sometimes, but Chuck was a funny guy in a lot of ways. I mean, funny, not necessarily funny, peculiar, and he enjoyed life. And he said at the end, and in his piece with his interview with Angus Anderson, that that he's an optimist. He said, if you're not an optimist, then why the hell would you put your pants on in the morning? And he felt that the biggest, and it's funny because Jack Tykinga has sort of the same feeling the way he approaches his photography. He said he can't understand the concept of fear. Why would somebody be afraid? He said that is humanity's greatest threat, according to both Chuck and Jack. That you've got to face up to it. The boat is sinking, but the optimist in you has to say, "But we can fix it." And that was Chuck's point of view.
Yeah, it's easy to think of Chuck as being morose and dour and moody and broody and some kind of curmudgeon, but exactly the opposite. As a matter of fact, toward the end of his writings, the last few books he wrote, I think you'll find the word yes as much as any word on a page, because he was trying to affirm that life is worth living and we can fix this. But that alarm thing, you have to go back and remember too, Bruce, that City Magazine, the first title for that magazine was Buzzworm, an alarmist rattlesnake image if there ever was one. And Chuck saw a lot to be alarmed about. He saw more in a day of violence and tragedy and sadness than most of us see in a month or a year. But he said in his book Trinity, he said, "My life is as broken as the ground that made me. I've spent a lifetime watching the murder of the earth all around me." And he also had a stark message that the future is going to be a collision between limited resources and unlimited human appetites. And Chuck was adept and enchanted, entranced, fixated, enslaved to talking about unlimited human appetites, including his own. And he was very candid, as you mentioned, about that. But these themes, once you read several of Chuck's books, from the beginning of Street Signs, Chicago, Killing the Hidden Waters, clear to the end to Jericho and Sonata, these themes run through all those books in one form or another. And especially in that you're the one that actually edited his Credo lecture for the Powell award he received in Tucson at the Pima County Library. And that was one of those kind of tell all, bare the soul, what have I been trying to do books. And but yet the optimism, he beats it kind of like a drum. And but Chuck, but Bruce, we have a book here with our name on it. How'd that ever happen?
You called me one day and said, "Let's have lunch," as I recall. Yeah, I remember distinctly. I guess you figured I had some time on my hands. I was getting close to deciding that I was going to retire, and I got a phone call from you and said, "Would you like to come have lunch?" And I said, "Sure." And Mary Martha Miles, who's Chuck's literary executor and who'd been his partner for years, was there. And lo and behold, you'd been working for a long time interviewing people and getting stuff down and on paper, transcriptions and whatever, and said, let's do a book. People are gonna know about Chuck. There are still people around who remember him vividly, who can throw light on his biography that's going to be helpful for people down the road, future biographies, and for people today who don't know or are just coming to read Chuck. And that's where it started. And from there, we collected 60 or so essays, which were turned in remarkably to me, who has been an editor for 40 years or so, on time. And we pared that down to 50 and made the pitch to the University of Texas Press, which wasn't a hard pitch at all, and got tremendous amount of help from Dave Hamrick, who was then the editor, now retired, and the rest, as they say in my profession, is history.
Yeah. And I was thinking about a couple other things that was a great experience working with Dave Hamrick and Joe Wilder at the Journal of the Southwest also, and having Mary Martha Miles involved and all those other people that gave us beautiful work. And almost to a person, they said, "Yes, I'll do it." And it was just marvelous working with those people. Chuck also told us that you either try to make things better or you wind up living without joy or hope. My work, with all of its sputterings, has been a desire to make sense of things, and to ease the pain I see around me. And especially in the Southwest trilogy he has, A History of the Future, big thick books, which are my three favorite of Chuck books, beside Blue Desert, Trinity, Inferno, and Exodus. He brings history to life and he gives it flesh and blood. You know, he goes back to those history days at Wisconsin and the University of Arizona that he was enchanted with history. And he defies us to look away and dares us to care about what's going on around us. You know, Chuck was a pretty non-judgmental guy, and in his world, you know, even the Charles Keatings wore gray hats. They didn't wear pure white or pure black hats, but he was really driven and compelled and relentless in his investigations. And, you know, at the end of his life, as he said, he had no retirement plan. He planned to write forever. And he would have, except his life is what we thought was cut short. But Chuck, Bruce, we have a couple. I'm talking to Chuck here. I'm channeling, I guess, the hat, Bruce. It's too tight. We got just a couple minutes left, but what's the big picture here?
Well, I think some of this is personal, some of it's not. But I think one of the to play off of what you were just saying, one of the real joys of working on this book is we brought all of these people to 5 dozen people, most of whom don't know each other, but they all knew Chuck. And by and large, although the essays aren't uncritical, because if you knew Chuck, you knew the flaws and the greatness in him. But it brought us all together for the first time. Chuck and Bill and I met people, at least online, that we hadn't met before. We engaged in correspondence with people that we didn't know, but who, we all had this common bond of knowing Chuck. And I think the thing I take away from Chuck is basically I've always been just really astounded by the breadth of his interests. I know I've never met anybody quite like it. He was interested in, it seemed, literally everything. And he could write knowledgeably about it because he read and he contacted people. He had just an unquenchable thirst to know. He had that reporter's impulse to ask questions that maybe you never thought about. And again, if you ever were on the phone with Chuck or just sitting around and he was talking at you because you probably weren't going to be having a conversation necessarily, you forgave him that because it was like he had all of this stuff bottled up inside of him and he couldn't keep it in. He would absorb all this material, digest it, and then it just came out of his mouth or out of his pen, which I think in a lot of ways makes him really unique. And I think the other thing too is his point that he made about fear. He recognized very real problems. We realize every day the truth of that. And I think if you read Chuck and you get into it, you're forced to say, what the heck are we doing? And why are we doing it, and how can we stop it? So that's where I come off with final thoughts on Chuck.
And we should probably mention, Bruce, since this is the visiting writers program, that our book, America's Most Alarming Writer, please realize that our book is also a direct and indirect look at becoming and being a writer. And I think for people wanting to pursue the trade, either on an amateur basis or on a part-time basis or professional, there's a lot of good information in there. And several little things come to mind. It wasn't Chuck, it may have been Hemingway or somebody, but somebody asked him how you become a writer, and he said, you type until your fingers bleed and then you type some more. And two keys to Chuck's personality: writers are driven people. They're not concerned about what time lunch is. They want to finish the page. Chuck said, I've never run 9 miles. It's either 8 or all the way to 10. And also he wanted dearly to hike the Arizona Trail, but he never got to or never did, from Mexico to Utah. Why did he want to do that? So he could interview people along the way. And for me, you know, looking at Chuck's books, maybe the best one was the second one, Killing the Hidden Waters, about the world and America's water crisis. And for me, Bruce, that book is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, and it's Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb. It's that magnitude of book. And for those reasons, Chuck should be read. And when I think of Chuck personally, I think of John Reed covering the Mexican Revolution, and Ernie Pyle on the front lines of World War II, and Edward R. Murrow making news incisive, readable, and interesting, and Robert Caro sticking to the story and finding all, I mean all, of the nitty-gritty details. Bruce and I thank you. It's good to see you all today, and Bruce and I hope to see you again soon. Take care.